Section 14 of The Girl from the Marsh Croft by Selma Lagerlöf. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Lars Rolander. Section 14. A Story from Jerusalem. In the old and time-honored mosque El-Aqsa in Jerusalem, there is a long, winding path leading from the main entrance up to a very deep and wide window niche. In this niche a very old and much worn rug is spread, and upon this rug, day in and day out, sits old Mesullam, who is a fortune teller and dream interpreter, and who for a paltry penny serves the visitors to the mosque by prying into their future destinies. It happened one afternoon several years ago that Mesullam, who sat as usual in his window, was so ill-natured that he wouldn't even return the greetings of the passers-by. No one thought, however, of feeling offended at his rudeness, because every one knew that he was grieving over a humiliation which had been put upon him that day. At that time a mighty monarch from the Occident was visiting Jerusalem, and in the forenoon the distinguished stranger with his retinue had wandered through El-Aqsa. Before his arrival, the superintendent of the mosque had commanded the servants to scour and dust all the nooks and corners of the old building, at the same time giving orders that Mesullam should move out of his accustomed place. He had found that it would be simply impossible to let him remain there during the visit of the distinguished guest. It was not only that his rug was very ragged, or that he had piled up around him a lot of dirty sacks in which he kept his belongings, but Mesullam himself was anything but an ornament to the mosque. He was, in reality, an inconceivably ugly old negro. His lips were enormous, his chin protruded aggressively, his brow was exceedingly low, and his nose was almost like a snout. And in addition to these, Mesullam had the coarse and wrinkled skin and clumsy, thick-set body, which was carelessly draped in a dirty white shawl. So one can't wonder that he was forbidden to show himself in the mosque while the honored guest was there. Poor Mesullam, who knew well enough that, despite his ugliness, he was a very wise man, experienced a bitter disappointment in that he was not to see the royal traveler. He had hoped that he might give him some proofs of the great accomplishments which he possessed in occult things, and in this way add to his own glory and renown. Since this hope had miscarried, he sat hour after hour in a queer position, and mourned with his long arms stretched upward and his head thrown far back, as though he were calling upon heaven for justice. When it drew on toward evening, Mesullam was wakened from his state of all-absorbing grief by a cheery voice calling him. It was a Syrian who, accompanied by another traveler, had come up to the soothsayer. He told him that the stranger whom he was conducting wished for a proof of Oriental wisdom, and that he had spoken to him of Mesullam's ability to interpret dreams. Mesullam answered not a word to this, but maintained his former attitude rigidly. When the guide asked him again if he would not listen to the dreams the stranger wished to relate to him and interpret them, his arms dropped and he crossed them on his breast. Assuming the attitude of a wronged man, he answered that this evening his soul was so filled with his own troubles that he couldn't judge anything clearly which concerned another. But the stranger, who had a buoyant and commanding personality, didn't seem to mind his objections. As there was no chair handy, he kicked aside the rug and seated himself in the window niche. Then he began, in a clear and vibrant voice, to narrate a few dreams, which later were translated for the soothsayer by the guide. "Tell him," said the traveler, "that a few years ago I was at Cairo, in Egypt. Since he is a learned man, naturally he knows there is a mosque there called El Azhar. which is the most celebrated institution of learning in the Orient. I went there one day to visit it, and found that the whole colossal structure, all its rooms and arcades, all its entrances and halls, were filled with students. There were old men who had devoted their entire lives to the quest for knowledge, and children who were just learning to form their letters. There were giantesque negroes from the heart of Africa, lithe, handsome youths from India and Arabia, far-traveled strangers from Barbary, from Georgia, from every land where the natives embraced the doctrines of the Koran. Close to the pillars, I was told that in El Azhar there were as many teachers as there were pillars. The instructors were squatted on their rugs, while their students, who were arranged in a circle around them, eagerly followed their lectures, which were accompanied by swaying movements of their bodies. And tell him that although El Azhar is in no way comparable to the great Occidental seats of learning, I was nevertheless astonished at what I saw there. I remarked to myself, "Ah, this is Islam's great stronghold and defense. From here Mohammed's young champions go out. Here at Al Azhar the portions of wisdom that keep the Koran's doctrines healthy and vigorous are blended." All of this the traveler said almost in one breath. Now he made a pause so that the guide would have an opportunity to interpret for the soothsayer. Then he continued. "Now tell him that Al Azhar made such a powerful impression upon me that, on the following night, I saw it again in a dream. I saw the white marble structure and the many students dressed in white mantles and white turbans, as is the custom at Al Azhar. I wandered through halls and courts and was again astonished at what a splendid fortress and wall of protection this was for Mohammedanism. Finally, in the dream, I came to the minaret upon which the prayer crier stands to inform the faithful that the hour of prayer has struck, and I saw the stairway which winds up to the minaret, and I saw a prayer crier walking up the steps. He wore a black mantle and a white turban like the others, and as he went up the stairs I could not at first see his face. But when he had made a few turns on the spiral stairway, he happened to turn his face toward me, and then I saw that it was Christ." The speaker made a short pause, and his chest was expanded for a deep inhalation. "I shall never forget, although it was only a dream," he exclaimed, "what an impression it made upon me to see Christ walking up the steps to the minaret in El Azhar. To me it seemed so glorious and significant that he had come to this stronghold of Islam to call out the hours of prayer that I leaped up in the dream and awakened." Here the traveler made another pause to let the guide interpret for the soothsayer. But this appeared to be well nigh useless labor. Mesullam sat all the while with his hands on his sides, rocking back and forth, and with his eyes half closed. He seemed to want to say, "Inasmuch as I cannot escape these importunate people, at least I will let them see that I don't care to listen to what they have to say. I'll try and rock myself to sleep. It will be the best way to show them how little I care about them." The guide intimated to the traveler that all their trouble would be in vain, and they wouldn't hear a sensible word from Mesullam while he was in this mood. But the European stranger seemed to be entranced by Mesullam's indescribable ugliness and extraordinary behavior. He looked at him with the pleasure of a child when it is watching a wild animal in a menagerie, and he desired to continue the interview. "Tell him that I wouldn't have troubled him to interpret this dream," he said, "had it not in a certain sense come to me again. Let him know that 2 weeks ago I visited the Sophia Mosque at Constantinople, and that I, after wandering through this magnificent building, stepped up on a minaret in order to get a better view of the auditorium. Tell him also that they allowed me to come into the mosque during a service when it was filled with people. Upon each of the innumerable prayer rugs which covered the whole floor of the main hall, a man was standing and saying his prayers. All who took part in the service simultaneously made the same movements. All fell upon their knees and threw themselves on their faces and raised themselves, at the same time whispering their prayers very low. But from the almost imperceptible movements of so many lips came a mysterious murmur, which rose toward the high arches and died away time and again. Then there came melodious responses from remote passages and galleries. It was so strange altogether that one wondered if it was not the Spirit of God that poured into the old sanctuary. The traveler made another pause. He observed Mesullam carefully while the guide interpreted his speech. It actually appeared as if he had tried to win the negro's approbation with his eloquence, and it seemed too as though he would succeed, for Mesullam's half-closed eyes flashed once, like a coal that is beginning to take fire. But the soothsayer, stubborn as a child that will not let itself be amused, dropped his head on his breast and began an even more impatient rocking of his body. "Tell him," resumed the stranger, "tell him that I have never seen people pray with such fervor. To me it seemed as if it was the sublime beauty of this marvelous structure which created this atmosphere of ecstasy. Verily, this is still an Islam bulwark. This is the home of devoutness. From this great mosque emanate the faith and enthusiasm which make Islam a mighty power." Here he paused again, noting carefully Mesullam's play of features during its interpretation. Not a trace of interest was discernible in them, but the stranger was evidently a man who liked to hear himself talk. His own words intoxicated him. He would have become ill-natured had he not been allowed to proceed. "Well," said he, when it was his turn again to speak, "I cannot rightly explain what happened to me. Possibly the faint odor from the hundreds of oil lamps, together with the low murmurings of the devotees, lulled me into a kind of stupefaction. I could not help but close my eyes as I stood leaning against a pillar. Soon sleep, or rather insensibility, overcame me. Probably it did not last more than a minute, but during this interval I was entirely removed from reality. While in this trance, I could see the whole Sophia Mosque before me, with all the praying people. But now I saw what I had not hitherto observed. Up in the dome were scaffoldings, and on these stood a number of workmen with paint pots and brushes. "Tell him, if he does not already know it," continued the narrator, "that Sophia Mosque was once a Christian church, and that its arches and dome are covered with sacred Christian mosaics, although the Turks have painted out all these pictures with plain yellow paint. And it appeared to me as if the yellow paint in the dome had peeled off in a couple of places, and that the painters had clambered up on the scaffolding to touch up the picture. But look, when one of them raised his brush to fill in the color, another large piece scaled off, and suddenly one saw from behind it a beautiful painting of the Christ emerge. Again the painter raised his arm to paint out the picture, but the arm, which appeared to be numb and powerless, dropped down before this beautiful face. At the same time the paint dropped from the entire dome and arch, and Christ was visible there in all his glory among angels and heavenly hosts. Then the painter cried out, and all the worshippers down on the floor of the mosque raised their heads. And when they saw the heavenly hosts surrounding the Savior, they sent up a cry of joy. And when I witnessed this joy, I was seized with such strong emotion that I waked instantly. Then everything was like itself. The mosaics were hidden under yellow paint, and the devotees continued all the while to invoke Allah. When the interpreter had translated this, Mesullam opened one eye and regarded the stranger. He saw a man who he thought resembled all the other Occidentals that wandered through the mosque. "I don't believe the pale-faced stranger has seen any visions," thought he. "He has not the dark eyes that can see what is behind the veil of mystery. I think rather that he came here to make sport of me. I must beware lest on this accursed day I be overtaken by another humiliation." The stranger spoke anon. "You know, O dream interpreter," turning now direct to Mesullam, as if he thought that he could understand him despite his foreign tongue. "You know that a distinguished foreigner is visiting Jerusalem at present, and on his account they have talked of opening the walled up gate in Jerusalem's ring wall, the one they call the Golden, and which is believed to be the gate through which Jesus rode into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. They have actually been thinking of doing the distinguished traveler the honor of letting him ride into the city through a gate which has been walled up for centuries, but they were held back by an old prophecy which foretells that when this gate is opened, the Occidentals will march in through it to take possession of Jerusalem. And now you shall hear what happened to me last night. The weather was superb. It was glorious moonlight, and I had gone out alone to take a quiet promenade around the holy city. I walked outside the ring wall on the narrow path that extends all round the wall, and my thoughts were borne so far back into distant ages that I scarcely remembered where I was. All of a sudden I began to feel tired. I wondered if I should not soon come to a gate in the wall through which I might get into the city and thus return to my quarters by a shorter road. Well, just as I was thinking of this, I saw a man open a large gate in the wall directly in front of me. He opened it wide and beckoned to me that I might pass in through it. I was absorbed in my dreams and hardly knew how far I had been walking. I was somewhat surprised that there was a gate here, but I thought no more about the matter and walked through it. As soon as I had passed through the deep archway, the gate closed with a sharp clang. When I turned round, there was no opening visible, only a walled up gate, the one called the Golden. Before me lay the temple place, the broad Haram plateau, in the center of which Omar's mosque is enthroned. And you know that no gate in the ring wall leads thither but the Golden, which is not only closed but walled up. You can understand that I thought I'd gone mad, that I dreamed. I had tried in vain to find some explanation of this. I looked around for the man who had let me in. He had vanished and I could not find him. But on the other hand, I saw him all the plainer in memory. The tall and slightly bent figure, the beautiful locks, the mild visage, the parted beard. It was Christ, soothsayer, Christ once again. Tell me now, you who can look into the hidden, what mean my dreams? What more than all can be the meaning of my having really and truly passed through the Golden Gate? Even at this moment I do not know how it happened, but I have done so. Tell me now what these three things can mean." The interpreter translated this for Mesullam, but the soothsayer was all the while in the same suspicious and crabbed mood. "I am certain that this stranger wants to poke fun at me," he thought. "Perchance he would provoke me to anger with all this talk about Christ." He would have concluded not to answer at all, but when the interpreter insisted, he muttered a few words. "What does he say?" asked the traveler eagerly. "He says he has nothing to say to you, but that dreams are dreams." "Then tell him from me," retorted the stranger, somewhat exasperated, "that this is not always true. It depends entirely upon who dreams them." Before these words had been interpreted to Mesullam, the European had arisen, and with quick and elastic step had walked toward the long passageway. But Mesullam sat still and mused over his answer for 5 minutes. Then he fell upon his face, utterly undone. "Allah! Allah! Twice on the same day Fortune has passed by me without my having captured her. What has thy servant done to displease thee?" End of section 14. Read by Lars Rolander.